he was going to go to MIT, but he got diverted, and he ended up working in shipyards to get through school, and he studied electrical engineering at Newark College of Engineering. Also at that time, he worked for Energy Systems, and he was working on electric car with Gene Cornini, who was often Otis Carr's right-hand man. So if you were here last night, you know about that. He worked for Bethlehem Steel, Piasecki Aircraft, Bechtel, and Synchro Corporation, among other companies, through his career. And he has his own corporation now, Marine Power and Control, custom automation systems for ships and tugboats. And now he has Nonlinear Dynamics Corporation as well. He's applying TeslaTech to developing a number of projects. So here's Jim Murray.
Thank you. Good morning, folks. This is going to be an interesting presentation because I have to cover an awful lot of ground in order to give you some insights into what I've been actively pursuing. I started into this work at 19 years old, and I'm now 60, so I'll give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm at. I guess you all know who this guy is. Tesla has been a cornerstone in my thinking and in my pursuits, since I was in high school. And what I want to do to start off the situation is to give you a little bit of background first on what got me involved with Tesla's work, and then from there I'd like to jump into a series of interesting events that propelled me into a real vortex of detective work, which I've been pursuing for many years, and then we'll conclude by talking about the stuff that I'm actually doing right now. Can we have the next slide, please? Obviously, for anybody that's a Tesla fan, you're familiar with the Colorado Springs laboratory. There's several shots of this available. Another one. And it's an interesting thing that when you speak to most people about it and they say, well, yeah, Tesla was making big sparks out there. And, as an engineer myself, I kind of raise my eyebrows when I hear that, because we can make sparks any number of ways, but it doesn't seem to have any practical application. So the real question is, what was he really doing there? Well, as any Tesla advocate probably knows, he was very interested in the transmission of electrical power without wires. And this facility was actually designed as a testing ground for his concepts in that regard. And the thing that's interesting about it is that later, when I mentioned the RCA Corporation and some of the things that went on there, it would be helpful if you think back to this initial part of the discussion, because what he was doing here is actually diametrically opposed to radio. What I mean by that is that the device inside this building was tuned in such a way that the current was actually maximized into the ground connection, and the emanation of EMF from the antenna was minimized, which is exactly the opposite of what we do in radio. And so he wasn't messing with radio, he was messing with a form of ground transportation. Thank you. He was messing with a type of ground transmission, which he hoped to actually use as a vehicle for making power available all over the globe simultaneously. The other thing, of course, is that, and this isn't talked about too much, the concept of a magnifying transmitter, which was also brought out later in the Wardenclyffe years, has to be touched upon, because that device, the word magnifying, was really very important. Now, it's true that he used cryogenically cooled coils, and he had very high Q in his systems, and he did a lot of real interesting things. But the absolute fact of the matter is that when you investigate the use, and I might add the selected use, of the term magnifying, It was actually because he was looking at systems that magnified the available power. And this is something which most people just can't grapple, because the persistent belief, of course, is that anything like that is a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. Unfortunately, the second law of thermodynamics is written about energy, not power. And if anybody really understands the physics of this stuff, there's an enormous difference between energy and power. Energy's become a buzzword in our time, which is ultimately associated with oil and coal for the sake of accounting, and it really doesn't have anything to do with the accomplishment of motivating machinery or producing some kind of useful work. And the reason for that is that the minute that you do something like that, the so-called energy that you're using is immediately converted to power, because time is brought into the picture. Let me have the next slide, please. So anyway, speaking of power, this is the internal view of one of his discharges. And of course, Tesla's sitting there in the midst of it apparently, but it's actually a double exposure. He wouldn't be quite that crazy to sit there like that. And you know, these modes of resonance that he was playing around with were twofold in nature. And it's very important to touch on that also before we move on. Everybody is familiar with frequency resonance. If you're a radio buff, or if you're involved with resonant transformers, or if you're just building Tesla coils, there's no real secret about frequency resonance. But the interesting thing about it is there's another type of resonance, much less understood, and that is referred to as energy resonance. And what it is, essentially, is the optimization of a circuit or device, it doesn't have to be electrical, in which the parameters are adjusted dynamically in such a manner that they produce the situation where you have constant power and an endless accumulation of energy. And I use that word deliberately in that case. See, what you have normally is accumulation of energy in most systems follows a square law function, and the first derivative of a square law curve is a linear curve, which is another way of saying that your energy and your power are both increasing, but at different rates. But if you understand the basis of energy resonance, then you can actually engender a situation in which the power is constant and the energy continues to accumulate linearly. And of course, the benefits of that become very rapidly apparent, because it means no matter how much energy you're trying to accrue, you pay the same price for it. So these were some of the things that Tesla was playing with in this machine. And also, the final thing that I want to touch on, can I have the next slide, please, is that he was also making use of another phenomenon which is talked about quite a lot by Tesla buffs. Even Tesla's nephew has written about it, but I don't think that it's completely understood. And that is that in these resonant devices that he was playing with in Colorado Springs, he actually had a third coil, or a tertiary winding, as it's probably referred to, which was mounted on the mast above the secondary. And the purpose of this winding has been a source of infinite debate for quite some time. But in reality, if the mechanism behind that is really understood, two things become apparent. First of all, the forcing function that he was using in this device was not a sinusoid. It was a very special wave function which he generated electromechanically through his own custom-built generators. And secondly, when this is used, it allows this type of a device to interact with the Earth's electric field in a manner that causes an amplification of a sort, which is based on a parametric principle that is not readily understood today. And that is what I refer to as the Tesla wave and the amplification that it's capable of causing. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, this is a picture of the first transatlantic station for radio transmission that was actually situated in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And the reason why it's important is because of the fact that it was here that some real interesting shenanigans went on with respect to the radio industry. Tesla was, in fact, the true author of radio. The patents that were eventually given to him after all the smoke settled proved that he was the inventor of that. As a matter of fact, history can be checked on it, that when Marconi applied for his patents in radio, he was denied patent coverage because of the fact that prior art existed in Tesla's name. And that's a well-known fact. However, at the time after the war, when this station became active, J.P. Morgan, who had been funding Tesla at Wardenclyffe, decided he wanted to get his hands on the technology associated with radio, and he encouraged Marconi to again apply for patent rights on the radio concept, and mysteriously it was granted at this point. And then, of course, the radio rights were assigned to RCA. And the interesting thing about it is the major stockholder in RCA was General Electric, which was pretty much owned by Morgan and Company. Next picture, please. This is a picture of the transmitter facility from the outside. And that building stood in New Jersey for quite some time, but then they tore it down because they built a McDonald's there, which, of course, is much more important. Next slide. This picture is kind of a historical picture of great significance because it is associated with the opening ceremonies that were conducted at this radio station. I don't remember the date, to be honest with you, but it was in the early 1900s. And the gentleman that with his head cocked to the side right there is David Sarnoff, who was later the vice president of RCA Corporation. The peculiar individual in the middle with the squashed hat is Albert Einstein. The little guy in the front is, thank you, Steinmetz. And over here to the other side is, can't think of his name right now, but he is the guy who took Tesla's concept of the high-frequency rotational generator, scaled it up and applied it to this station, which then produced something like 200,000 watts at a frequency of 25,000 cycles. Alexanderson was his name. Next slide, please. This is just a picture of the interior of the station. My apologies to you for the lack of clarity, but it's a very old photograph. Next one. These are some of the generators that were used to power the installation. I think we have a better picture next of that particular machine. Actually, that's a very beautiful picture when you see it in its original shape. But that's a monster of a machine. And Alexanderson is also, I think, in one of these pictures posing, standing on the engine base that would give you an idea of the size. Next one, please. Yeah, there he is. And so anyway, the interesting thing to consider is why were all these dignitaries invited to this opening occasion? And incidentally, Tesla was invited and he declined. He wouldn't attend. And of course, one of the reasons for that is that the intention of the powers that be at that point was to openly tie electromagnetism into the theory of relativity and make one big new science, or whatever you want to call it, which the world could then embrace, and it would only lead in one particular direction, and that is to absolute control of the technology, linear energy systems which can never produce any significant gain, and all of the wonders that we now feel the pressure from on our hip pocket. And that was all set into motion approximately at that time. Next slide, please. This, of course, is the incomplete transmission station at Wardenclyffe, which is actually Shoreham, Long Island, New York. And the building at the bottom was the laboratory and also the transmission, had the transmission facilities in it. The tower, of course, even though it was incomplete, was the basis for Tesla's form of Earth transmission. And I think we have a better picture of that tower in the next, yeah, there you go. That was with the electrode at the top almost finished before the aluminum plating would have been put on. Now, the purpose of this tower was not to transmit power all over the world, as a lot of people insinuate, but rather it was going to be his world communications system. J.P. Morgan was funding it at that time, and the intention, of course, was that he would have a monopoly on radio communication. Marconi built a very small transmitter, which I think he used to communicate across the English Channel, or perhaps it was the North Atlantic, I don't remember which. And Morgan figured that he had one up on Tesla, and so he pulled the plug on the financing. But actually, this facility was supposed to simultaneously transmit radio, telephone, facsimile, telegraph, and any other imaginable form of communication simultaneously on a very large number of channels. And that was Tesla's dream child. And it would certainly have changed the world if it had been allowed to mature. Next slide, please. I threw this picture in for a very significant reason, which should become apparent a little bit later on. Actually, Tesla kept copious notes. Most of them have wound up in the Belgrade Museum in present-day Yugoslavia. Some of them have been published in lectures, patents, and articles, and also in the Colorado Springs Diary. But there's many such writings that are still floating around in private hands. And one of these was referred to as the Blue Book, or the Blue Notebook. And the Blue Notebook had a whole bunch of very unusual things written in it. There is no absolute proof that this document was authored by Tesla, but there's a lot of secondary evidence that points to the fact that it might have been. And that's actually where my story begins. Next slide when you get a chance. This character is Otis T. Carr. You all heard about him yesterday. And before I get into that aspect of it, I want to read something kind of interesting, which is traceable back to Tesla. And this has to do with the whole Carr, Carini, Grotz, Murray situation, which is what I'm here to tell you about. Tesla says the following: I was working 20 years ago on the wireless transmission of electrical power. My original idea for a flying machine was a device propelled by electric motors which would receive power by wireless means from stations located on the Earth. However, eventually I began to consider the problem from a different point of view and realized that it was mechanical in nature rather than electrical. The flying machines of the future, my flying machines, will be heavier than air, but they will not be airplanes. They will have neither wings nor propellers. You might see them on the ground and you would never guess that they were flying machines. Yet they will be able to move through the air in any direction with perfect safety and at higher speeds than have yet been achieved. It will be able to remain absolutely stationary in the air, even in a strong wind, for great lengths of time. Its lifting power will not be dependent upon any delicate devices such as a bird has to employ, but rather upon positive mechanical action. It is the child of my dreams, the product of years of intense and painful toil and research. I'm not going to talk about it any further. However, whatever my airship may be, here at least is an engine that will do things that no other engine has ever accomplished. Now that's a pretty interesting statement coming from a guy who's already changed the world. And when I read stuff like that as a young guy, I was pretty animated by it because it was inconceivable to me that the guy who gave us robotics, primitive X-ray machines, the polyphase transmission system, the Tesla turbine, and God knows how many other inventions, all of a sudden became an idiot, and started rambling on about things that were totally impossible. It's just not his way. I think he kept his character till the day he died. And so I took it very seriously, and I said to myself, I bet you there's something to it. Well, the interesting thing is that sometimes serendipity plays a part in all this stuff. I was given a gift of a book around this time when I was struggling through college, and the name of it was They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers by Gray Barker. Now, I read this book with an open mind and thought it to be pretty interesting, but frankly, the information that was disclosed was not half as exciting as the disclosure of the name of a certain individual. The guy's name was Dominic Lucchesi, and it turned out he lived in Jersey City, only a few blocks away from me. And this was a real incredible thing for me because up until that time I'd been pretty much working on my own, rambling around trying to make sense of things, and yet here was a guy who was already written about and offered in the book to discuss this and other incidents with anybody that was interested. So naturally, I became friends with this guy, and during the course of our relationship, he introduced me to a fellow by the name of Eugene Carini. And Carini turned out to be a real unusual dude, and he was, in fact, the electronics technician that worked with Otis Carr. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Carr and Long John Neville back in the 50s. I don't know exactly what the date of it is. And they are discussing on the radio or for the radio or TV Carr's concept of the what he called the circular foil spacecraft. And there's an 18-inch model there sitting on the table in front of them. Now, interestingly enough, Carini eventually confided to me the interesting fact that when Carr was building these devices, he always secluded himself. He was also quite a drinker, by the way. He secluded himself in his office with a nice bottle of whatever and always perused the contents of this mysterious blue notebook. And of course, Carr's explanation was that he had known Tesla back in the 1920s or 30s when he was going to school in Brooklyn, New York, and working nights at the Pennsylvania Hotel as a package clerk. And of course, anybody who knows Tesla knows that he had a mania for feeding pigeons. So this guy wound up delivering bags and bags and bags of birdseed to this one sweep, and eventually started to wonder, what the heck is this guy doing with all this birdseed? So ultimately, the story goes that they became some kind of friends, and that over the course of the next couple of years, Tesla bequeathed to Mr. Carr some very highly secretive information, which he then turned around and tried to make use of in the 50s. Carr started a corporation in Baltimore, I think it was in 1952, and it was called OTC Enterprises, and they started with this small model and began to raise money to build larger and larger craft. Next slide, please. These are just various views of the internal workings of this ship. You can see that there are actually two separate flanges involved. The inner one carries a plurality of devices known as Utrons, which are very unusual geometric devices that work on a special shape. And these are then forced to rotate beneath the field poles, which are on the outer flange. And the relative velocity of these two devices produces an electromagnetic effect which counteracts the force of gravity, according to the theory. Next slide, please. This is Major Wayne Aho, who became the public relations guy for OTC Enterprises, and he's holding the finished model, or part of the model, in his hand. Next slide. This is the 6-foot model that was actually reviewed with John Neville for the TV shows that followed in the 50s. And from what I understand via Mr. Carini, there was actually a larger one that was about 18 or 20 feet in diameter, which was built in Oklahoma City. And that was the beginning of the end of Carr's public relations when that thing was tested. Next slide, please. This is the OTC X1, the 6-foot model, or actually no, this is the smaller one. This is the 36-inch model, and it was being built by an aircraft corporation in Oklahoma City. 2 or 3 of these were made. Carini wound up with one of them. I think Ralph Ring's organization wound up with another, and then one was stolen from what I understand. Next slide, please. This is an interesting sign that was put up in the Apple Valley, California area, and it was probably a very expensive undertaking as far as advertisements go, but the interesting thing about it is there's a platform over here on the left which actually has a small model of the intended design of the ship sitting there, and interestingly enough, that also vanished one night. Next slide, please. This particular picture is the 45-foot craft which Ralph told you about last night, and this was the result of the patent denial for a transportation device, and so they turned around and made an amusement park ride out of it, and believe it or not, this thing was located at Frontier City in Oklahoma City, which is an amusement park area. And these folks here, I guess, are about to get on board there for the ride of their life or something. Next slide, please. Now, this is a little bit out of sequence, but actually, this is a picture of Mr. Carr in a hospital bed. And the reason for that is that when they fired up the larger model in Oklahoma City under the direction of Mr. Carini, there had been a great deal of shortcuts taken in its construction due to lack of funds and what have you. And the central accumulator, which was charged with mercury at that time, supposedly exploded, leaving a lot of terrified people running around. But when Carr rushed in to turn the power off, he was overcome by fumes and therefore hospitalized. Now, this enchanting young man is myself at the tender age of 18. And I was experimenting with my own nuclear assemblies. This device here was a small particle accelerator with an ion source on it. And I was investigating the disintegration of boron by accelerated protons. And this won me quite a bit of notoriety in New England, where I went to school. And I eventually was going to go to MIT and pursue a career in high-energy particle physics. But that's not what happened. Next slide, please. After I graduated high school, my dad died in my senior year, so I went to work in a shipyard to support myself and to get up money for college. But I couldn't leave the accelerator stuff alone, so I built this linear accelerator, which was powered by a Cockcroft-Walton voltage multiplier, and I had this in my basement, which was pretty exciting. The neighbors didn't like it very much. The interesting patterns that it produced on people's television screens and what it did to the radios in the neighborhood, you know, left me with a rather tainted reputation. Next slide, please. That's me in a certain state of nirvana as I fire up my homemade accelerator and use it to do sundry experiments. Next one, please. Okay, now we're almost caught up to the point where I left off in the story. This little car here is known as a King Midget Racer. And when I was hired as Director of Research and Development by Carini's organization, which was called Energy Systems Incorporated in Bolton, Connecticut, this was the first car that we produced. Next slide, please. Now, the reason that this is exciting, I'm a little bit disappointed with the clarity of this picture, but if you look carefully, you can see that in the back of this car, the motor has been removed, and there's a motorcycle wheel in there which is mounted on an axle, and around the periphery of that wheel are 3 or 4 half-horsepower motors which are actually assembled in such a way that they rotate with the wheel. And this was my first introduction to this whole concept of counter-rotation, which Carini introduced me to. And at the time, it was a little bit overwhelming from the mathematical point of view to understand why it should work any better than anything else. So my job was to essentially analyze the merits or lack of merits of this particular device. And of course, his stockholders were very excited to get positive results. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of the first unit. If you look carefully, you can see that it's chain-driven. And the torque that this thing produced was astronomical. And I must say that running on 2 small standard car batteries, this little vehicle really performed to the point where it made everybody wonder. Next slide, please. This is one of the first prototypes that I built for GEET. And what it is essentially is a device with a built-in torque and speed transducer that allowed me to investigate the 2 modes of operation associated with counter-rotation. There's some pins on the side of this device, and if you insert the pins, the motor, which is a pancake magnetic motor that you see in the middle there, essentially becomes a normal motor. And if you pull the pins out, it's actually capable of delivering 2 modes of rotation, and the outputs are then combined. And so studying this thing, I was hoping that we'd be able to get some insights into the merits of so-called counter-rotation, but frankly, it didn't show anything astounding. Next slide. This is just another view of the same device seen from the side. There's a torque loading wheel over here that uses a canvas belt to supply a load, and the device in the middle with the coupling on both sides is the torque transducer. Next slide, please. This is the gearing on the back of the device that, when it's in the counter-rotational mode, automatically combines the output from the armature to the output of the stator. Now this is a little bit more interesting. This is a three unit motor that Carini used to refer to as the energized flywheel. It's a smaller version of what was in the King Midget Racer, and it performed extraordinarily well, but at that time I didn't have enough mathematics under my belt, and I didn't have enough money or instrumentation to really analyze why it should be better. Next slide. This is a larger unit that we built on the same principle. It was about 4 feet in diameter, and frankly, it was worse than the small one, even though we put a lot of pains into making it into a really well-designed prototype. It was about 17% efficient, which didn't turn me on. Next slide, please. That's just another view of the beast from the side. The idea here was to power a generator with it, and in accordance with the teachings of both Carini and Carr, we should have seen an enormous amplification of power, but naturally there was nothing. Next slide, please. Now this monstrosity, and I'm definitely used the term deliberately, this was the actual straw that broke the camel's back in the corporation that we were dealing with at the time. Carini had a dream one night, I'll never forget it, about covered wagons crossing the prairie. And the big wheels on the side of these prairie schooners got caught in a rut, you know. And so the horses couldn't pull it free, but 2 men got back there and used their hands on the top of the large wheels and rolled it right out. So Carini came running into the lab one morning in his bathrobe, and he said, I got the answer, I got the answer. We're putting it in the wrong place. He said, we need to put the large wheel on the road. So this monstrosity was built from a Corvair, and it has 4-foot wheels on it. He wanted 6 foot, but we couldn't find them anywhere. And this thing here actually was made from a cotton harvester that we bought secondhand from the cotton fields of Louisiana. Next slide, please. That's yours truly in the device on the day which spelt the end of energy systems. These fellows actually had the audacity to drive this out onto Route 6 in Connecticut and hoped of actually going into Hartford, accompanied by banners and cheers and whatnot. And it stalled out and burned up on the first hill that we encountered. Next slide. So naturally, after all of that hoopla, I decided the best course of action was to go back to engineering school, and I went back to the shipyard. That's me as I was working as a diesel mechanic at the time, and I enrolled in Newark College of Engineering, where I stayed for the next few years. And that's me leaning against a propeller on one of the tugs that I was servicing at the time. Now we come to a very interesting chapter in all of this. Carini had talked about a guy named Grotz, and that's not really his name, but I don't think it's a good idea to use his real name since his family is still living and still embarrassed. But anyway, he was building a 32-foot spaceship in northern Michigan. And among other things, he had a city of light, which he was building, which composed of very unusual geometrically planned buildings, pyramids, towers, all kinds of things of that sort. And his cover story was kind of interesting. He claimed that as a young boy he had been contacted by aliens and that they had given him the secret of universal law and the application of all such matters to the betterment of humanity, including alien technologies. And so in order to get involved with this whole thing, you had to actually move up there, buy a plot of real estate, and then you would sort of limp along with the rest of them. Next slide, please. This is the hangar that they built on the shores of Lake Huron in a secret location. And I might add, it was pretty out of the way. The letters on above the door there, ASDP, stand for Advanced Saucer Development Project. Next slide, please. Now this, believe it or not, is the 32-foot ship. It's difficult to see because the cab section that held the passengers was small with respect to the high voltage flange, but that's what you're looking at. Next slide, please. This is a picture taken from inside the passenger compartment, and that's one of the control panels that was mounted on the wall. And naturally, it's conveniently located next to a porthole so that you can see where you're flying. Next. Now, this was impressive. There was a company in Detroit, Michigan, that actually laid out hundreds of thousands of dollars to contribute this transmission. This is the thing that coordinates the rotation of the flange, the upper and lower flange, and the cab, so that for every clockwise turn that the upper flange makes, the bottom flange makes one counterclockwise turn, and the cab remains stationary. Otherwise, it'd be like riding inside a clothes dryer. There are no ferrous components in this transmission. The gears are stacks of aluminum and phenolic, which are held together by brass threads, brass threaded rods, and the bearings are nylon. And the reason for this is the intense magnetic field would heat that thing to cherry red, and you wouldn't want that at 20,000 feet. I don't know what that is. Oh, that is the undercarriage of the ship. It's a little hard to distinguish, but the two projections that stick out to the side are the lag magnets. And the reason that I'm pointing this out to you is I'm going to tell you a very interesting story in a minute, which was one of the only positive things that came from these early investigations. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll stop there for the moment. Now, this guy, Grotz, he had a blue notebook. And he used to reference this blue notebook all the time. And of course, I didn't know it at the time, but it turns out it was the same blue notebook that Mr. Carr used to have. And in that blue notebook were all of the technological sketches, formula, and what have you to build these machines. So it's very, very strange when you stop to think of it that these guys who set out to build free energy devices, levitational craft, and all sorts of wonderful things were making reference to a blue notebook which Carr himself ultimately admitted he had received from Tesla. Now, I probably at this point would have written all this off except for the following. I was invited at that time to see a demonstration of this technology by Mr. Grotz. And he had a laboratory in his basement, and what he had set up down there was a vortex motor. And this vortex motor was a very unusual thing to behold. And essentially what it did was it created unpaired charge, or in other words, a charge that has its countercharge at infinity. And it just spins this into creation, and the room fills up with this peculiar haze. And then he had a Van de Graaff machine, which he turned on after the fact. And within minutes, the entire room was charged to the point where anything metal was undergoing an actual discharge of sparks. Now, I've built Van de Graaff machines, I built Van de Graaff accelerators, I played with Tesla coils and all kinds of stuff, and I can tell you that that was a very unusual experience, and the only thing that I ever saw from these early investigations which led me to think something real was associated with that notebook. This picture is me at a later stage in life when I was hired by Bethlehem Steel as the electrical supervisor for their mining division. And this was in close proximity to the hidden saucer base. Next slide. One of the biggest complaints that they had at the time was too much power was being consumed by the mill and by the electric shovels. And so, as fate would have it, they were going to scrap an old Bucyrus Erie digging machine. It was a 1926 vintage, and it was powered by a Ward Leonard system. And the heart of the machine was a very large General Electric synchronous motor, and it was, I think it was operational at 4160 volts. So anyway, instead of scrapping that machine, I said to these guys, look, I'll build you a machine in my spare time over the next few years that will save you a lot of money. And I said, I promise it won't interfere with my work. That was only partially true. But anyway, I undertook the development of this device. It took 3 years to build. It was a large synchronous capacitor that had modifications of my own on it. Next slide, please. That's me when I was a little bit younger, and I'm leaning against the final product there, the finished generator set. This machine was so powerful it put out 800,000 VARs, and I could affect the government hydro station 60 miles away in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. The thing that was interesting about it, I used some very interesting technology that I had developed myself at this point in conjunction with a standard regulator, and monitored the droop in the electrical plant, and then supplied the starting current and whatnot from inside this machine. Of course, the net result of that was that the electrical demand meters were practically asleep, and the power company came over and said, well, we know that you have bypassed our meters, and so we want to do a complete check of your facility. Well, naturally, they didn't find anything illegal, and they were totally perplexed at this machine, but it cut off about 20% of their electric bill. I was very popular with Bethlehem Steel, but not so popular with the local power people. Next. This is the high voltage control section of the same device. It's a little blurred, I'm afraid, but you know, it was one of these deals that used a very high inductance starter and then a manual transfer switch, and then after that it would be pretty much self-regulating. Next slide, please. This is another view of the interior of the synchronous capacitor device, and the unidentified object on the left is actually the exciter, the rotary exciter for the main generator fields. Next slide. Now, this is the diesel engine. It was an Fairbanks Morse OP. There were two of them. They were 5,000 kW apiece. They were located across the river in Detour, Michigan. And the reason why this is important is because of the following little story. Next slide, please. This is the control room that was manned by a friend of mine, which turned out to be a lucky thing, who used to put the engines online and support both the Bethlehem Steel's mining division and the local township. Whenever there was an ice storm or inclement weather, they would open the tie links to Sault Ste. Marie and isolate, and then we would be on our own power. And this turned out to be a very exciting thing for me because having built this VAR station, what?
We're running out of time.
Already?
Yep.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, let me conclude with this then. This VAR station that I built in conjunction with this diesel engine proved to be a really exciting thing, because what I did was I switched the polarity on my regulator in such a way that I encouraged power oscillation between my station and this station. Well, what was interesting is that I also changed the reference frequency and what I was looking for was the proper parametric coupling frequency to achieve this mode of energy resonance that I talked about earlier. And the ultimate result was that first all hell broke loose in the town, which is regrettable, but sometimes things like that need to be done in the quest of science. But once it reached this interesting mode of resonance, the diesels had no load on them, and yet everything remained lit. And that is the beginning of a very interesting story, which it looks like I'll not be able to tell you. Next slide. This is my little research shop in Michigan, and in here many things eventually came to be developed. Next slide. This is the result of my thinking about that experiment that I did with the Detour generating station in conjunction with my VAR setup. And it is essentially a new type of generator known as a Dynaflux alternator. And what it does is it encourages a mode of resonance in which power is actually oscillated between the electromagnetic field and the mass of the rotor in such a way that the power is used over and over and over again, as opposed to being just consistently drained from the prime mover. The result of this, of course, is that the prime mover sees no load when you put a load on the machine, and yet you can draw, I think this little model here produced like 14 amps. And according to Lenz's law, that should be enough to put a very hefty torque on the prime mover, but the result was that there was none. Next slide. This is a larger version using a very big permanent magnet from a klystron modulator that I took apart. Next model. Okay, and then this is the presentation model which I presented to a financing group in New York that offered me $25 million for this concept, but I turned it down when I found out that the boys involved were skull and bones. So that may have to be where we stop this. Do we have time for a couple of questions or not? We have no time for questions, so you'll have to tackle me in the hallway. But thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this much of it anyway.
We want to thank you very much. We're going to take a short break. We're a little bit behind schedule, and we're going to hurry back in about 10 minutes, okay?